Sitting here this morning and last evening, I couldn't help but remember what happened to me just a month ago. Is my microphone on? Are you able to hear? I was at the MCC Material Resources Warehouse in Ephrata. Some of you have been there, where 90% of MCC's material resources going to the global community passes through that warehouse. It was a busy day there because there was a very large Amish group that had come in, and as they do every morning when they arrive, they come seasonally, January through August, and then it's harvesting and marrying and Christmas and so forth, and then they come back again in January. But they had strung out their lunch boxes on the four long rows of tables there. Unfortunately, there was another group coming that I was supposed to speak to that day. There was a bunch of young people, about 60 of them, some going on one-year assignments and some coming for one-year assignments. So here's this group of people from sort of all over the world, and we had to make space for them. So I took the liberty to take all those lunches on each of the four tables, and I scrunched them way up against the end of the one table. Just after I'd done that, one of the Amish grandmothers came in looking for her lunch. She probably had found a book in the book recycling project, and she wanted to put it in her lunch. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I just messed up all these lunches. I don't know if you're going to be able to find your stuff." And I said, "But maybe you're used to this." I said, "Does it ever happen that after church, all these buggies and all these horses, they all kind of look the same, that you get the wrong horse with the wrong buggy?" And she said, "Ken, let me tell you a story." She said, one day Jake had hitched up the horse and he was on the way home, and after he picked up his wife, and they're driving along. This is a story she told me. And then the wife looks over and says, "Jake, I think we have the wrong horse," or "Husband, I think we have the wrong horse." And Jake looks at her and he says, "I have the right horse, but I see I have the wrong wife." And I felt like that story over the last number of presentations. There's so much stuff here. How do you ever sort it out and make sense of it? I mean, some of these speakers have been flying through these boxes of materials. There's just so much stuff. And there have been wonderful, wonderful presentations. I've enjoyed them thoroughly. I have learned so much. And I anticipate that these boxes will take lifetimes to page through and for people to figure it all out. But it is almost overwhelming to me just to know, and we're looking at one individual here. My attempt today will be to enter into the Russian experience of our friend Oliver Miller here. I never met him. Our lifespans overlap, but I have no recollection of having met him. But only do it perhaps in a bit of a cursory way. This coming year will be the 100th anniversary of MCC's founding, and perhaps there will be other opportunities to do some of the in-depth stuff which this really deserves. But I want to simply illustrate some of the kinds of things that Alvin was involved in. I thought when I started researching this, I knew that I could borrow at various libraries feeding the hungry. But I thought, I really should have my own book. So I went online and I bought a used book. Some of you might know. Who knows Wayne Alva Yoder? Taught for 38 years. Does he happen to be here? I don't think it's your brother. 38 years, I didn't think I'd seen him here. At Frostburg State, I believe, taught entomology and general biology and zoology and so forth. I went online and I bought his book. Listen to what it says inside. To Wayne Alvin Yoder, on graduation from high school, May 28, 1961. I was in second grade. With heartfelt congratulations and all good wishes, Alvin J. Miller. I thought, I have a book autographed by the one whose story this is. I paid $30. I got a real bargain. Alvin J. Miller's book. And so I was so glad to be able to yet again go in here and look at what is happening here in this event. And I will do like some of my predecessors in presenting here and do a little bit of background to it. I have the advantage of going last in this series of presentations. The advantage is that I've had the opportunity to learn a lot of stuff from other presenters. The disadvantage is that some of the rest of us have spoken about some of the same things. So when we get to those spots, I'll do it fairly quickly. But you see, Alvin, the book that I was just talking about here on the screen. One of the things we have not talked about, which is integral to this whole story, is this question of which direction shall we move? When things were unsettled in Europe in the 1700s, there were many Mennonites and in the late 1600s, Amish as well, who were making a decision, do we stay in Europe or do we move? And for many of us here of Swiss-German background, our ancestors made the decision to head eastward. Perhaps they went up the Rhine River like my family did and got on ships in Rotterdam and found their way into the port of Philadelphia. And for many of the folks in this area, settled first of all in Berks County and then later moved westward. There were other folks who made the critical decision about moving eastward. That decision, which was fairly neutral when it was made a huge difference in the subsequent generations of those families. You know your story. If you have been here in this community, you have had blessing upon blessing. If you move the other direction, we've touched on some of those stories. I would challenge any of you to think of any place where you would find pictures like we've seen if your family has been the story of the Swiss-German westward movement towards Philadelphia. Catherine the Great, the late 1700s, inviting Mennonites from Europe, Northern Europe particular, to come and settle in Russia. This is setting the stage for the stories we've been hearing. This is hard to see, but these are some of the Mennonite colonies that have been established over 150 years in southern Russia and in the Ukraine. This is the geographic context in which the stories that we've been hearing and more of which you'll hear here. It was more than a century later, after these folks had made the decision to move eastward into Russia, into the Ukraine, and they were tremendously blessed. Good farmland, institutions, schools, lumber mills, building. It was something that worked until, and here's where we come to this problem of now there's trouble. There was civil war. In any society, civil war is always an issue. I lived for a number of years in a country racked by decades of civil war. Finally, in 2011, they tried to solve the problem by creating the newest country of the world and carving off the southern third of Sudan to make the Republic of South Sudan. It did not solve the problem. Civil war is always a problem. Some of you may have family stories of the American Civil War. Confiscation of property. We had heard allusions to that already. The communists taking over and the collective farming coming. And on top of that, not enough rain. This is what sets the context. And now when we have this great war, which is what World War I was called before there was a World War II. Nobody ever called it World War I. No one ever hoped or assumed there'd be another one, but there was. And out of that comes a dramatic change in a world awareness. Added to that discussion was this group of 3 million servicemen who had served overseas during World War I. It's impossible for us to grasp how dramatically that impacts a society. This would have been a significant percentage of the American population when they came home in 1918, 1919 and following. But this is supposed to be a picture of a ship, but you can hardly see the ship because there's so many people. Dramatically and changes it. Woodrow Wilson came back from Europe with an idea where he was saying, let's embrace this democratic ideal where people can govern themselves, and let's embrace this idea of being open to others. His League of Nations, that of course did not happen. That did not happen. The League of Nations was rejected by the American government, but his ideals were reflective of many people in our society, and for the first time that, and some of the leading up things that we've heard already, It provided the opportunity for Mennonites and Amish to see things in a new way and to realize that there was a brand new world to them out there and about. People like Alvin Miller had been doing this, sending back stories, sending back letters prior to this, as Kenton and others have shared. We've already talked about the American Relief Administration and Herbert Hoover. It was this activity of Herbert Hoover's which actually set the stage for him to campaign as president. He probably is remembered more fondly for this involvement than for what many would see as a fairly ineffective presidency. But this was a coming together. The American Relief Administration was an umbrella organization that was helping to coordinate and work with various other relatively newly formed, and we heard some of this before, organizations. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, 1914. American Friends Service Committee, 1917. The American Mennonite Relief, a program within Mennonite Central Committee, 1921. Here we see a picture of a truck with the ARA sign on it. This, I don't know what they're hauling, but this is just an image of that kind of relief work. This is kind of an unusual picture. This is on the frozen Volga River in Russia. Can you see the animals? Here ARA is using whatever means of transport that's available. Fuel was sometimes in short supply. And here I have no idea where they got the camels, but they're using camels as transport. All of this is leading up to what we're going to talk about. Look at this American Mennonite Relief that is part of this system. World War I, 1914, Russian Civil War, 1918. World War II ends. The American Relief Administration, that's the ARA, Herbert Hoover. Mennonite Central Committee, the American Mennonite Relief begins. That's the AMR. That was the program that Alvin Miller was administering. The Soviet Union is established. The American Relief Administration ends. After the Soviets started selling grain, the American public was no longer supportive of American Mennonite Relief and the American Relief Administration. The American Mennonite Relief, though, continues for a bit after that with the partnerships they had already established. We should note that the sisters in our churches were an integral part of this, and we'll come back to this just a little bit later. But the first decades, mostly, there were a few folks who had started sewing circles in their churches before the turn of the 1900s. But in the early 1900s, there are sewing circles all over the place in the last few years and the years coming that are celebrating their centennials. This was the way that it was a socially acceptable way for sisters to be involved in the same urges that were driving these brethren into the global work of the church. And so the sewing circles become a very important part, and I think Kenton mentioned some of that. And then in 1920, July, in Elkhart, Indiana, the basement of the Prayer Street Mennonite Church, 13 men representing 5 different Mennonite groups coming together, and finally coming to the conclusion saying, we've had these various committees, the Mennonite Brethren and the Crimmer Mennonites and the Eastern Mennonite Boards of Mission Charities, people who have this interest. Why don't we come together and make some kind of a coalition, a temporary organization, they said. And all things, I suppose, except the kingdom of God are temporary, so I suppose it is. But that was the organization that got this, what my friend Peter Dick used to call, he said, it's a very colorless name, Mennonite Central Committee. And I suppose it is a fairly colorless name. And we've already heard of these 3 guys who went on an exploratory trip in 1920. One of the questions that virtually always comes with international work, regardless of the organization, is to say, is the story we heard the real story? Let's go see with someone who we know will give us the true story. And so these 3 guys set off from Indiana, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. We've already heard of Clayton Kratz and how he disappeared. An entire story. I could spend my whole time on this, and that would actually be fun, but that's not my assignment. John Ruth, who was here last year, several years ago, he gave me a little hint. He said, Kratz actually had a strong relationship with a young woman, and they were planning to be married. And he said they never were because Kratz didn't come back. Edith Miller waited for 10 years, and she was engaged to someone else, Smucker by name, in the Worcester, Ohio, Kidron, Ohio area. And the month of the wedding, she cut it off, and she said, what if Kratz comes back? She eventually does marry someone, Lautenschlager. If you get to Apple Creek, Ohio, look for the Presbyterian Cemetery and look for Edith Miller Lautenschlager's tombstone. It's a sad, sad story that hasn't gotten enough of acknowledgement of someone who for decades and decades and decades had this empty hole in her heart and her experience because the man she hoped to marry, she didn't know that he was killed. He just disappeared. Is he going to come back? But John Ruth said, she eventually married, had children and grandchildren. He said, there is a rumor that in that family, the Lautenschlager family, there's actually a hope chest that Kratz had given to Edith Miller. Anyway, I went on that. MCC doesn't pay me to do this. I do this in my own time. I went on that journey, and it's a whole story. I found the chest in the upstairs of Vicky's house there. She wouldn't invite me in until I returned a year later when I was at the CMC conference in Hartville. I went back to Worcester, and I said, I'm back here now. Remember we talked last year? And she remembered. I said, I'm back here now with my wife. Can we go see the chest up in the bedroom? And so we did. And then I learned out of that at that point, yeah, this is just a few years ago, she just died last year, there was a younger sister still living. And I went and visited Maud Miller Pettis in Connecticut. And she said, Ken, you know, Kratz, Edie never forgot Kratz, she said. Edie never forgot Kratz. Interesting enough, the granddaughter who had the chest didn't know the story. I said, at first she didn't connect, and she said, oh yeah, Kratzy, yeah, Grandma talked about Kratzy. I said, do you know his story? She said, he disappeared in the service. That's what she said. That's all she knew. I said, do you know that just a few miles away in Kidron, Ohio, now there are thousands of people together raising money at a benefit auction for an organization founded by those who went with Kratz? She had no clue. It's kind of interesting to tell somebody's own story to that individual. Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole nother topic. A few pieces of remnants of Kratz. Ory Miller, we've met Ory Miller. It's interesting to see how God moves in a mysterious way. Ory Miller was a man without a whole lot of direction as he was graduating from Goshen College, and then his father-in-law said, why don't you come and work in my shoe factory? Ory Miller made a good living selling shoes all his life. He was already at the shoe factory at this time, and this picture is taken in 2015, a very young man. And he volunteered his time for 20-some years. He was a volunteer director of MCC, never took a paycheck. He got to Akron, either by circumstances or by the intervention of the divine, I don't know. But when he was a Goshen College student, as Goshen College students or any college students want to do, two guys agreed that they're going to go on a double date. That's nice. And so they're going to have a double date. And so they came to Culp Hall on Goshen College campus. Two young women are going to meet them there. They had missed one little critical detail they had never resolved, and that's which girl goes with which young man. Ory Miller, ever deferential, said, I'll take the second girl. Her name was Etta Wolf. Her father had a shoe factory in Akron, Pennsylvania, and the rest, well, that's a whole other story. Yeah. We're passing by exit ramps here that I must pass by. Arthur Schlegel, he's sometimes the unsung hero because he did more work of those three in this system we're talking about. He was a very close contact with Alvin Miller. He did more work than the other two, actually, I might say, in actually the relief work. But he died young. He was killed by a bull in the early 40s on his farm in Illinois. And we sometimes forget. Ory Miller went on to a long, colorful life. Kratz is essentially a martyr. And Arthur Schlegel, the workhorse, sometimes is forgotten. But this exploratory trip that we've talked about now led to the formation of the American Mennonite Relief, the AMR, and the AMR worked closely with the American Relief Administration. And the first and only for the whole time the AMR was in operation, it was your hometown man here who provided very, very able leadership. I'm just so grateful to this congregation, this community, and the larger church around here who nurtured and offered this man. Offered, maybe that's not the right word. Provided is perhaps the right word. To be part of the work of the church at one of the most critical moments of the church trying to find its position vis-a-vis the much larger world out there. And so Alvin Miller, as we've heard before, arrives in Constantinople in January 1921. It's an amazing thing to me that he would choose to engage in that just months. This is just a few months since October 1920 when Clayton Kretz disappeared and nobody knew what happened. Well, they knew he was arrested by the surprising entry of the Red Army into the little Mennonite village of Hauptstadt. They knew that's what happened, but no one else knew what happened beyond that. And Alvin Miller, it seems, at great personal peril, is entering into that flow of activity. And so this, and I think we've heard this before from Lowell, he's just describing here what this is. It's an unofficial volunteer American organization. This is the American Mennonite Relief, and it's going to provide relief supplies into Russia. And the agreement between the American Mennonite Relief and the Soviet republics, there were 19 points. Interesting to me that some of those ideals, as you might express them, are still with us today. That you will not turn away people for assistance because of religious or political or ethnic reasons. And MCC still does that. Sometimes gets in trouble because people say, why? There's a driver brought an Amish group just the other day, and she was looking at the list of shipments inside the foyer of the Material Resources Center that I mentioned first. And she looked at that list and she said, why are you sending canned meat to the North Koreans? And I happened to be right there. I don't remember what I said. If I wanted to be smart alecky, I may have said, oh, God created them too. I don't think I said that, but I could have. But this is one of the 19 points that you go in, and anyone who is in need of assistance that was within your purview, you are assisting them. Another one of the points was, and this is an interesting point, that AMR relief aid will be given preference for transport, and it will be adequately guarded in transport. Now that raises some very early questions for non-resistant people. Do we rely on the military to guarantee the work that we're doing? And in the sequel to this, there is nothing consistent in that entirely, because sometimes, as Robert Kreider said, in the post-World War II, the only thing moving in destroyed Germany in World War II was the military, and so MCC was using military to move food around. Other times, the church will say, we're non-resistant people, we will not rely on armed escort to keep us safe. And sometimes that backfires. Glenn Lapp's family just commemorated what would have been his 50th birthday, a Mennonite Central volunteer in Afghanistan in 2010. Working in the rural area with a bunch of folks giving eye care, and some bad characters happened upon them, executed all 10 of them. Glenn was the only MCC worker, but a very, very sad story. His testimony was, we're just trying to be a little bit of Christ in this conflictual situation here. But those are some of the agreements. And with assistance from the Quakers, we heard of the American Friends Service Committee already, the Mennonites get assigned to work with Mennonites. I think of the story of Moses. Isn't the story of Moses such a wonderful, wonderful story, where here is this little Hebrew boy and being claimed by the princess, but he needs a nursemaid. And you know the story, you know? So the Mennonites get assigned to Mennonites, the Hebrew nursemaid gets assigned to the Hebrew baby. Feeding the hungry then became this final report, along with there's other activity in here beyond just the Russia. This book is not just AMR, but it's a larger story. I might just comment, unfortunately you can't see them, but see those two little circles there? If you have a book or you want to look at my book, look at that. It's the forward and the obverse of a coin which was given to the American Mennonites by the Russian Mennonites during this era. And the coin has a story. In fact, the children's book was just written about this. I don't have the title in my head just now, but there's a Lisa Weaver who wrote this story of Jacob Clausen finding all these bullets from the Civil War in the trees and on the ground, and he took these bullets and he melted down the lead and he turned it into a medallion. And that medallion it will be mentioned just a bit later. But that's the image here. This is a medallion now in the Kaufman Museum, I think, in North Newton, Kansas. And this is a letter on Christmas Day, 1921, that came. Our food since last spring has been black tea and herring. And now, dear friends, all of this is gone. If you can't help, then we will die of starvation. On Central Street alone of our village, 42 persons have died during the summer, and most of them for want of food. We are in need not only of food, but also of clothing. That's been a theme, has it not been? That's been a theme. Some of you will remember my late friend Peter Dick died at 95 in 2010. He was living as a young child. I remember Peter telling the story of how he would go to school. He was hungry, and sometimes there would be an empty seat of someone in his school. He's just a little child there in the Russian community, the Mennonite community in Russia. But people are dying. People are dying. He said the cemetery was a bit of a distance away from our community, so the pastor would go out in the morning for the first funeral and just stay there because it's not worth walking back and forth. There will be more. Peter never forgot that it was this work of Alvin Miller and the generosity of people associated with this American Mennonite Relief program of MCC that saved his life. He never forgot that. We're going to come back to that idea as well. Here's the situation. We've seen enough of pictures. This is not a good picture. Where have I been working from? I've been working mostly from the archives of MCC, but here they're trying to plaster a house. I'm sorry, the picture is quite dark. Food shipments, though, became the first order of business. When people are hungry, you don't sit down and talk about other stuff. Where can you get a job? Maybe a job would be useful, but when you're hungry and there are no jobs, you need food. And so that's what happens. This warehouse was, the first 2 floors was used by the American Mennonite Relief in Alexandrovsk in Russia. You can't read this very well, but this is a list of contents. This is actually food being distributed by the contents of a food packet, American Mennonite Relief, with American Relief Administration. But there's flour, there's sugar, there's tea, there's rice on that list. Jim, I think I'm stuck, or am I stuck on my slide there, or did I turn it off? I speak to a lot of Amish audiences. I never struggle with technology when I'm with them. Yeah. Or did I? Maybe I squeezed the off button. Yeah. I'm not sure when I'm off. Did I just turn it off now? And now I'm on. Now let's try it again. Oh, there we go. Okay. Again, these pictures that we have are so long ago. Photography is fairly elementary, and so the ones I'm working with are fairly, some of them are not great, but here is an example of the kinds of canned food and dried food which is going into the Mennonite communities. This is Jacob Dick's lumber store, and it was one of the first feeding stations. This picture was taken in June 2019. The building is basically abandoned, but sort of as the kickoff event to commemoration the hand of God moving through American and Canadian Mennonite and Amish communities for 100 years, several MCC boards went this June to have their annual meeting in the very communities we're talking about here. And this is one of the buildings that remains from that era 100 years ago. It's amazing to go back and say, this was a feeding station, one of the very first feeding stations for the American Mennonite Relief. Alvin Miller certainly was in that building in Russia. And they kind of recreated the meals that people may have eaten there. And so you can see here that I was not present for that. I would have loved to be present, have been present for that, but I was not. But someone who was tasting of this meal said it was a fairly tepid meal, but it was food nonetheless. When you're hungry, it doesn't matter if it's not your first choice. And this is some food created as a reenactment of that. But this is the real situation here. These are thousands and thousands. It's impossible for us to think about Alvin Miller and Arthur Schlegel there feeding tens of thousands of people because of the generosity of folks like your families. And so the feeding was the first thing. Food was the first order of business. American Mennonite Relief, and we could go into details, but let's just think about that. Of the need for food. Clothing, as we've heard already in some of the descriptions, desperately, desperately needed. Ory Miller wrote this in 1922. We already heard the name of Mary Mellinger. Mary Mellinger was instrumental in getting sewing circles. I know her from the Lancaster area, but I know her influence and her work went far beyond that. And here Ory Miller is writing about Sister Mary Mellinger, reporting that from March 2 to July 31, it's just a handful of months of this year, they sent out to 151 sewing circles. That's a lot of sewing circles now. Sewing circles are going here by this time. And to 151, a total of 11,888 garments for Russian sewing. What they were doing, and this cutting room continues to this day. It's been incorporated into the Material Resources Center of MCC. But what they would do is cut out these large stacks of cloth, patterns of clothing, and then sewing circles would sew the clothing. So that's what she means, that we sent out the cutout material for 11,888 sets of garments and she calls it Russian sewing. And different circles have already written in, this is Ory Miller writing on the same letter, and asked relative to the further need of Russian sewing. This is 1922. The initial food shipments have gone in and now working with this clothing. Brother Hebert gave a report in his recent trip to Russia. He says that all we can possibly do during this winter along these lines, sewing clothing, will not be enough. Growing one's food is always better than receiving handouts. We know that. We know that. Sometimes in the work that I'm involved in, we simply call it development. Relief work is the emergency. Development is helping people be self-sufficient. I believe Phyllis showed this picture last night. It's not a great picture, but it's a gaunt horse. It's a horse, if you can look closely at it, it has the body type of a dairy cow. Ken, you know what a dairy cow looks like. You should be able to see the ribs and the sunken body cavity on a dairy cow. That's what this horse looks like. That is not a healthy horse. That is a cow that's milking. It looks like a dairy cow horse. This horse isn't hungry anymore. This was the story over and over and over again. If the horses survived the war, either by being stolen or killed or eaten, they now have nothing to eat. And how do you farm if you have no horses, and that's what your equipment is for? And so people were stuck with that. Here's one way to replace the horsepower. This is a picture from, I don't know who took it, but it's one of those first guys going in there. And this is a picture between the communities of Friedenfeld and Kortitsa. And you can see how the horses work. Similar picture, Blue Mennonite girls. These are the horses. These people are hungry. How is this ever going to work? And then this is the thank you when help comes. Here in the valley of the shadow of death, your appearance and your untiring efforts with those of Professor Miller under the direction of the brethren in the distance promises to us 1,000-fold blessing. We understand that you have come to suffer with the suffering and weep with the weeping. May you be used in the fullest sense as the Good Samaritan to apply oil and wine to the wounds in Christ's blessed name. In the end, all help cometh from him. I heard a Brethren Christ Church leader from Philadelphia just on Wednesday go back to that story, the oil and wine of Luke 10 and the Good Samaritan. This, my friends, is the work of the church. This is the work of the church. Individually, congregationally, and with the institutions that we can embrace around the world. Replacing the lost horsepower. The Fords and Tractor. 1922 and 1923, 50 Fords and Tractors and Oliver Plows. A couple of decades ago, the Ertl Toy Company reproduced this tractor and put the MCC decal on it. And so there's, in a little display case back here, a Fords and Tractor and an Oliver Plow Take a look at it. The Fords and tractors were $395. We got one just as a historic piece to park in front of the Material Resources Center. We paid a lot more than that in 2000. And the Oliver Plow, $65 Oliver Plows. And these were promoted by a farmer in Kansas and said, these folks do not have horses. Here's what we can do about it. And you and your community, with the support of many other communities, did that. The Fords and tractors in Russia. A little bit of an interesting thing coming in. People had not seen tractors before. In fact, I would observe, I know in my home community, and I suspect it's the same case here, these folks had tractors before people here had tractors. I still remember, even though we had a tractor, I still remember mowing hay with the mules. The John Deere Reaper, I know how to drive a team of mules. But these Fords and tractors, and I'm not 100 years old, these Fords and tractors were there and were quite a fascinating thing. Let me just read an excerpt from this Feeding the Hungry book about this. Interestingly enough, here it states that on the 20th of September, this would have been 1922, the 20th of September, which was yesterday. So that would have been what, 3 years off of 1922, 3 years off of 197. Yeah. And the 20th of September was a day of great rejoicing and anticipation for Hauptstadt. That's the village where Kratz disappeared, incidentally. It was on that day that the first shipment tractors arrived. For months, the people had been watching and waiting for this thing. Now they were really here, and everyone was anxious to see how they looked. The young and old, the rich and the poor, and the hungry and the satisfied, all were eager to get to the station and watch them unload the wonder thing. And another place they call them the crawly things. And it makes an interesting little comment here and said even the Jewish people were interested, but they stood at a distance until they got brave enough to come and see what these things are doing. Informed people are of the opinion that next to the blessings of God, it will be the tractors that we will rebuild Russian farm industry. Here they're harvesting. Can you see the binder? That would have, of course, been pulled by horses. I have old order Mennonite neighbors who use the same kind of binder now yet. So I can visualize this. That's, of course, pulled by horses. Here are the rye sheaves. This is rye. This is American Mennonite Relief rye. Rye sheaves lying there, and it's hard to see on this picture, but there are the wheat, the rye shocks on this picture. It's a rye field near Kortitsa again. And here's the threshing machine, and so you can see they're using a belt there. I'm not sure how that is powered, but they're threshing the rye. And so the assistance from the American Mennonite Relief, and this is Alvin Miller's work. He is the administrator, the first and only administrator of American Mennonite Relief. It was food, and some examples, corn flour, rice. It was clothing, it was tractors, it was plows. And at some point they were actually buying and selling horses from within Russia, going to a place where there were plenty of horses, bringing them to communities that didn't have them. And for a while, an experiment of raising sheep and making wool and teaching people to make clothing out of the wool. And the total disbursements were about $1.3 million. I estimated maybe about $20 million on online translation of current dollars, but it probably was more than that, actually. After these tractors were there and they saw these crawly things plowing fields much more efficiently than the horses, the Mennonites in Russia took upon themselves to send back a thank you note, a Denkschrift, a thank you writing from the Mennonites in Ukraine to the Mennonites in America in December of 1920. I'm not 100% sure if this is the original. It may well be, but it's a thank you note. And they use sort of century-old flowery language on some of these, some of the writings that they do. But it's very interesting to see how they express themselves here. They say, for example, through your generous assistance, a shipment of tractors, you have aided our agriculture system in a tremendous way. This is a deed of major significance for the Mennonite story, which will be recorded in history. And I note that 100 years later, we're still talking about it. The hand of God is on this meeting. I thought about that this morning as we listened to Speaking Beyond the Grave of Professor Miller here, reading from Psalm 90. Because the allusion to Psalm 90 is the way this Denkschrift, this thank you note, concludes. Do you remember you folks are Bible readers, you know. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. The last verse, verse 17, the last phrase of verse 17 from Psalm 90. And that's how this, the writers of this, the lead writer is B.B. Janz, J-A-N-Z. And he writes, and may the Lord your God be gracious and advance the work of our hands and yours. Yes, the work of our hands, may he prosper. And they don't mention Psalm 90, but that's what it is. Men and Mennonites had to make a decision after the initial famine crisis passed. Here again, a parting of ways, a decision to make. Like in Europe, do we go east or do we go west? Some folks said after the initial famine was over, we will make a living here. Others said, we don't trust this system, we will not stay. From 22 to 27, about 23,000 Mennonites left Russia because they said, this is not going to work. Peter Dick's family, among those who left, went to Canada. Here's a group of wagons assembled by the train, those long ladder wagons for hauling farm materials. They're on their way out. Here's a Schellenberg family inside the train on their way out, resettlement in Canada. This is all history, but that legacy continues. Alvin J. Miller is yet with us in what he helped us to understand what we can do. Relief food supplies still happens. Agriculture improvement still happens. And inter-Anabaptist cooperation still happens, thanks to people like Alvin J. Miller. Here's a conservation agriculture program. These women started doing new stuff, no-till agriculture, and it dramatically increases their production in Burkina Faso. Here's canned meat, going of all places to Ukraine. I suppose you are following news from time to time, perhaps see it in the newspaper or other news sources. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia is still with us now, and there are hungry people in Ukraine. The work of the church through the sponsor of American Mennonite Relief, MCC, Low Bender's on the board for the East Coast region, along with Brethren in Christ, Mennonites of all sorts, Old Order Amish, Beachy Amish, 23 different conferences or groups. And it's these collective efforts of Mennonites and Brethren in Christ and Amish that continues to bless the world in the name of Christ. And I come here to this gathering with a profound personal and I dare say institutional sense of gratitude to this congregation, this community, and to your extended families for the gift that Alvin Miller was to the church. And so I've brought with me a few things I would like to offer to those of you who are interested. If you would like to have a copy of the Denkschrift, I made some photocopies of this, and they're on their cardstock. They're back here on the table, and you can take a copy of this Denkschrift, this thank you note, with you. There's also an English translation in a 8.5 by 11 paper there. So pick up the English translation unless you read tiny German script well. And to keep it nice, there are some big manila envelopes back there. I'll pick one of those up as well. And then because one of the last things that Peter Dick did in his life, and he and I spent a lot of time together in his very elderly years, into his 90s. We did a lot of speaking and storytelling in schools together. Sometimes I would send the Henry's Red Sea book to the Amish school teacher in advance, and she'd read the story. And then it literally, so to speak, Peter Dick would step out of the story. This is now World War II. And tell the story of the Berlin Exodus that's recorded in Henry's Red Sea. Peter's life and his wife Elfrida, but Peter particularly because he was born in Russia and remembered that famine. He never forgot the generosity of people like Alvin Miller. And in his very old age, he said, I would still like to do something to benefit other people. And one day, he was living in a retirement community here at Scottdale because his daughter and son-in-law lived there. He found a piece of wood, and he cut out one of these little triangular jump-a-peg games like you see at Cracker Barrel. Weiß was ich meine? You know what I mean? Okay. And he made one of these games. And I said, oh, let's see if we can turn that into benefit for MCC. And we took it to the Pennsylvania, or the Tri-State Relief Sale down here in is it McHenry? Deep Creek, Deep Lake, yeah. And it sold for $225. And Peter was so fascinated, he started making a bunch more. And I collected these, and I said, I'm going to keep some of these till the centennial, and then I want folks who are good friends of Peter Dick and of this story, this narrative, to have some of these. So Peter made a number of them. There's a little paper inside that tells about this. The paper's from several years ago while Peter was still living. But if you are here and you'd like this personally made by Peter Dick, and he put a little sticker on that describes it, I don't have a lot, but I'd say one per family, as long as supply lasts. There's a box under the Denkschrift back there. Take that along. Pick up a Denkschrift if you like, the English translation, an envelope to put it in, and a Peter Dick personally made jump-a-peg game. They're yours because I, MCC, and the church want to say thank you for sharing Alvin J. Miller and saving the life of Peter Dick and many, many other people. May God bless you.
So Ken is wired with his microphone, and I can use this microphone. What are your responses, your questions?
Yes, please.
Certainly appreciate your excellent program here, and the last presentation, all the presentations were just great, fantastic. I have a question, just out of curiosity, about how many Mennonites would be in Ukraine or Russia and Russia today?
Yeah, that's a good question that I unfortunately don't have a good answer to. I can answer it sort of in pieces. There are almost no remnants of what would have been a continuous Mennonite presence since the time we're talking about. The folks who stayed behind, some of them were shipped off to Siberia. Some of them have been absorbed into other church groups, Baptists and so forth. There would be a significant population of Mennonites that have the same names, so the typical Russian Mennonite names, that have resettled in Germany in recent decades. And they would be related to some of these families. But if we're talking about an indigenous Mennonite population in Ukraine connected to this story, there's almost none. Yeah.
I'm just trying to remember. The feeding started in winter of 21. Is that correct? Winter of 1921?
I think that's correct, yes.
Yeah. And so then the feeding continued through, was it 1925 or 1926? Do you know?
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of institutional question there, because the American Relief Administration pulled out, was it in 2022, was it 23? 23. And the American Mennonite Relief continued with the partnerships that they had, the agreements that they had. The MCC board made the decision to shut down American Mennonite Relief in, I think it was August of 1925, and this would have been Alvin Miller's work. But it did not actually close up, and I don't know why. This would be a subject for another investigation. They didn't actually close up shop until 1926. It was in 1926, literally, when American Mennonite Relief came to an end. Yeah.
So there was a mass starvation in the Ukraine in 1932-33 that wasn't well publicized to me, as far as knowing about that story, until I saw a picture display in Union Station, Washington, D.C., and that was related to Stalin's policies of economics of wheat production, just taking the wheat from those people, even arresting people where they found that the wheat was stripped off the stalk in the field. And I just wonder, you know, with your story here and how that related later on, maybe with some of the same people that were left.
I mean, that's possible. I wouldn't know specifically there. What we do know, of course, and this is the other part of the Peter Dick story, is that when there was an opportunity for German-speaking Mennonites living in Russia, living in Soviet Union, Soviet citizens, when there was an opportunity for them to get out, many thousands of them did. And this is now within living memory of some of you, and I see Ruth is here. Ruth Yoder, but there were thousands of Mennonites who escaped with the retreating German army out of Russia as the war was winding down. And part of that story is the folks who ended up stranded in Berlin and then getting the miraculous delivery, Henry's Red Sea story, to Paraguay. So what we do know is the Mennonites knew that staying in Stalinist Russia was not a future they wanted. They refused to return. The ones that were stuck in Berlin after it was surrounded by the Russian zone after the partition, after the war was over, they couldn't stay there. They had no documentation. They were undocumented aliens, but they were not going to go back to Russia. And it was because of that kind of thing. Whether there were specific individuals who had their grain stolen, I don't know about that, but yeah.
With respect to the question of closing down the feeding program, at one point, the Homeland Committee made a decision to close, in fact, and I'm not clear on the exact date that happened, but bottom line, Miller got in touch with them and said, it's too early to close, we're not finished. And my sense is, without specifics, that the work of Miller continued sometime after the Central Committee had made, in fact, the decision to discontinue.
Yeah, that's what my understanding would be as well, Lowell. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
My question is unrelated to my question is unrelated to the main topic of discussion, but early on you mentioned that MCC delivers food items to North Korea. I'm curious to know how you accomplish that.
Very carefully, yeah. Well, one of the ways that MCC has always chosen to operate is to be entirely upfront with who we are. We are American, we're Mennonites, we're Christians. The cans of food coming into North Korea will each one say, in the name of Christ. And we've discovered, we need to wrap up here, but what we've discovered is that when you don't leave surprises sort of lurking around the shadows when you're dealing with people, then you can work. I've personally rode around with North Korean government officials from the Ministry of Public Health. They took me to church in Pyongyang, North Korea. And we were distributing. I have hardly ever helped to distribute material resources because it's almost always partners, but in North Korea, I did have the opportunity in some of the far outlying rural areas to carry knotted comforters and cans of meat. The other thing that's a little bit of an aberration there is MCC almost always works with indigenous partners we find in Sudan, the Sudan Council of Churches. Here we work with another North American organization very closely associated with the extended Billy Graham family called Christian Friends of Korea. So MCC, Christian Friends of Korea, Christian Aid Ministries all work out of the same warehouse in North Korea to take goods into North Korea. It's a wonderful testimony in a place where a testimony is very difficult to deliver. Yeah. Ken Yoder has. We've got to wrap up here, David. Yeah.
At the beginning, you mentioned that some of the people went east and some went west. There is somebody here that who's a descendant of the people that went east, and she experienced the ravages of World War II. And recently there was a book written about her experiences.
So I understand.
And MCC is mentioned quite often in there.
I have seen it.
And as a token of appreciation for the help you gave them, she wants to donate a book to the MCC library. And if you would take the book now. She'll bring it up to you. And I think it would be a good idea if you could go up front and you and Ruth pose while she's handing the book to you. And we'll have somebody take a picture.
All right, Ruth will come forward.
Well, thank you. I'm deeply, deeply touched by this because I was not personally involved with the story I told you or the story that Ruth experienced. But I can stand on the shoulders along with hundreds and hundreds of other people to say, even today, we can be touching the world in the name of Christ. And so, on behalf of others, Ruth, I accept this book. I'm deeply touched by it. Yeah.
I was a girl from West Prussia. I spent 3.5 years in Denmark in a refugee camp, and we didn't go shopping for 3.5 years. So you can imagine that we needed some help. And MCC was really, really helping us. Even brought our family together again after my father and us, we were separated for about 4 years, and he found us when we were in Denmark. So MCC, we couldn't do it without MCC. And we also, our new homes were built through MCC and PACS.
Ruth, if I may, I'd like to just offer a prayer for you and your extended family in this community. Thank you, O God, that you bless the church and the world with people like Ruth and Ruth's family and the writer of this book and the record of being in Christ for these many, many years. We've talked about a lot of pain here, but we know that where sin abounds, grace does much more abound, and may we be part of the solution to the world's pain even today. Thank you for the gift of Ruth to this community. We pray in Christ. Amen.
Well, thank you, Ken, so much for your presentation.
Gertrude Slayball was the writer of the book. She took the courage to do it.
And Gertrude is here. Gertrude right up front, yeah. So she's in that family. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, for the presentation, and it's so challenging, so inspiring.